All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you are joining in. We are very happy that you've decided to join in, and I'm looking forward to our presentation today. My name is Lisa Spencer, and I am one of the proud board members, as well as one of the CoSN chairpersons for the conference this year. And on behalf of CoSN, it is my pleasure to welcome our distinguished education strategist and author, Mr. Michael Horn, who is also CoSN's opening keynote. So I am so looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Michael. How are you?
I am great. Delighted to be with you all today. So thanks for having me, Lisa.
Oh, thank you for being here. I am so looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us. I just finished reading your book, From Reopen to Re-Event, and boy, recreating school for every child. Definitely a dream come true. It is definitely something that I see as a great need. Hopefully, we're all able to see that, but unfortunately, I'm not sure that's true. So, Michael, can you first start us out by telling us about the origin of your book? Where did it come from?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I should say to all those tuning in live or afterwards for the keynote, never say you're looking forward to it till after the fact, right? But I look, the book came out of just the turmoil and chaos of the pandemic. And what happened was me and Diane Tavner, who runs a set of schools in California and the state of Washington, she and I both started getting outreach from parents and educators who were like, what do we do? This is spring of 2020. And we started a podcast called Disrupted, where we started answering effectively questions about, different things that parents or educators were asking, like, why does school work this way? Why is it that some kids don't have access to the internet? Why is it that we're getting all these worksheets, things like that, right? And as started to flesh it out, I was like, wow, like there's a lot here that people haven't thought about, why our schools function and work the way they do. But equally, there's so many educators who in the heat of the moment were saying, we will not go back to normal. Like normal was not working for so many kids. And yet we're kind of slipping back into a little bit of normal, I think, right now. And so the book was designed to say both, here's a different vision for what school can do for each and every child, and not, make sure we're serving all children so that they can fulfill their human potential. But secondly, what are the actual steps? Like, how would you set up the innovation? Because we all know educators are under so much pressure right now. So I wanted to give them a little bit of a playbook of how to find some capacity, if you will, Lisa, because times are tough right now.
Very much so. Wow, that's awesome. Um, when the pandemic first hit, as a former instructional director for technology and support, I thought, oh wow, this is a blessing in disguise, because coming from a big school district, one of my desires, and one of the things that we were pushing from the technology side of the house, was let's bring in the technology so that we can become one-to-one, because if we're truly having a conversation and talking about preparing our students to be college and career ready, being ready for the real world, where is the technology? But then there's also the part about training our teachers, because they need to know how to utilize the technology effectively. They're using it for instruction. We have the situation where we are now one-to-one. Training hasn't necessarily caught up, but what do we do? I mean, everyone's stretched, but if we're truly ready to prepare our students, where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of this, right? Is that we know that there's the day-to-day pressures, and there's a lot of research, frankly, from innovation, not just in education, but lots of sectors, that the day-to-day and immediate and urgent will crowd out the really important, right, work that is critical for want to go, right? And to make room for that work, schools, districts, whatever the unit is, right, have to carve out separate areas where those educators or those individuals have the full freedom and flexibility to say, the only thing I'm caring about is creating that vision of the future. And so they're sort of freed from all of the fights at the school board meetings or all the pressures of needing just to reopen, all the questions, that are sort of flying at them fast and furiously. They have the capacity and the freedom to take that technology, as you said, to figure out what's the model in which we want to use it. Because I think one of the biggest challenges schools face is it's not necessarily the training per se or the technology per se. It's like the model itself has to change, right? When we did Zoom, but we still tried to replicate our current classroom that already was not doing great for lots of students. And now we just tried to do it online in this impersonal way with a bunch of students that didn't have great internet connectivity and all the rest. Well, of course it was going to not be great. But if you change the model of learning itself and then let the technology and the training follow in pursuit of that, you can realize something different. So it's all about like, how do we find those spaces for autonomy? How do we create those schools within schools? There's a bunch of districts that said, hey, I see all these micro schools and pods going up. Maybe we could do that too, right? And staff them with great educators that really have this freedom. And then, the last part of that is you sort of grow your way into the innovation, which is to say, yeah, it starts out as this small thing over here, but just like success in sports, success is a tractor in education, because teachers, parents start to say, wait, how come those kids are getting that? I want my kids to have access to it too, or I want to teach in a stimulating, rewarding environment. And one by one, what we see is that at different grade level, different classes, et cetera, will start to migrate over to these models as they prove successful.
Wow. So with the influx of the funding, we've got all this different curriculum, but a lot of it is still being presented in the same format.
Yeah.
How do we fight this resistance to change?
Yeah. And this is the other part of it, right? Which is that in the days and weeks and months after the pandemic hit, we immediately started saying, oh my gosh, think about the learning loss that's going to happen to kids. Think about the trauma. Think about all these challenges on educators, burnout, et cetera. A lot of threat framing, right? Like how terrible this is going to be. And I know a lot of educators are sick of that framing because they want to get to an asset mindset and so forth, not a deficit mindset. But actually, it was really useful, to your point, in framing it as a threat up front, because it galvanized resources. So we wouldn't have gotten all that federal money if we hadn't said the house is on fire, right? No one would have paid attention. And so the house was indeed on fire. We got the money. But here's the other thing. The research on innovation is remarkably clear on that, is that when you leave it in that threat framing and you leave it in your current organizational model, basically what gets implemented is a top-down command and control, do what we've always done, just with these new resources mentality. And that explains what you've seen, right? We got the technology, but now we're presenting it instead of the whiteboard or whatever it was, right? And the whiteboard itself was instead of the chalkboard. So like we haven't really changed the model itself to create self-direction for students, to create learner agency, things of that nature. And it turns out that that's the other reason that this independence and autonomy is so important, is because it allows you to rethink how we're actually offering, and I say offering learning experiences instead of delivering, right, instruction. Because it gets away from this top down, this is the way we've always done it mentality. And so you take the resources and you use them in these new buckets, essentially, right? And to really rethink and reinvent the school model itself. And we'll get to talk about this more in the keynote, obviously, in just, I guess it's about 2 months exactly. We're going to get to talk about, how these spaces give these school communities led by educators really the freedom to have conversations about what's the purpose of schooling? Like, why are we here? And then backward design new models in pursuit of what we're trying to help students know and be able to do. And we don't butt up against, well, gee, this parent says, I don't want my kid doing that thing. Fine, don't opt in right now. Well, once you see what we're doing, my guess is you'll come, but we don't have to have that conversation or that fight right away.
Right. I love that in your book, you presented some of the frameworks and the models that could be utilized or implemented for this change, or just to help reimagine and just do things differently. So your frameworks, you were talking about a lot of the research that you did. Is there any particular ones that you would promote, or put one over the other, or?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a great question. Gosh. Wow. So I think each one is staged, right? So, the threat rigidity that we just talked about, for example, I think is a really good framing one for how do we create capacity to innovate and escape sort of the day-to-day pressures that keep us locked where we are. I really love the tools of cooperation framework that appears much later, which says not everyone's going to agree, and not all the time, on the goals of the organization or how we get there. And so as a leader, you have lots of tools to sort of inspire or manage or motivate people to get wherever you want to go. But the really sort of rich irony is that most of those tools don't work most of the time. And so how do you assess what the level of agreement is in your schooling community? And as a leader, figure out, okay, this tool is more likely or less likely to work accordingly. That's one of my favorite theories, and it doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, because we tend to, when we talk about leadership or management, we tend to listen to the podcast or read the article that promotes one style, right? And I think what this is more saying is like different styles work in different circumstances. You get to be adaptable and figure out the right one for the situation you're in. And this sort of resonates for me because, like, you'll read Jim Collins, for example, who says the humble leader is always better than the charismatic one. But then, like, that doesn't explain why Steve Jobs was so wildly successful at Apple, because he was neither humble nor uncharismatic. He was very charismatic, and he certainly thought highly of himself. And he was wildly successful. But there are circumstances in his own life where that didn't work, right? When he was, the first time he was leading Apple a few years in, that management style did not serve him well. And so helping make sense of where these things work and when they work, I hope will be illuminating. So that's actually one of my favorites that I think doesn't get a lot of attention, but when I present it with educators, they get pretty excited. So that's why I pulled that one in.
Awesome. So I strongly encourage you to get the book because there's a lot of information, and Michael definitely covers a lot of different scenarios in the book, a lot of different perspectives, and particularly for the parent view. What did you do to get that information?
Yeah. So this was super fun to go deep in. We've done a bunch of jobs to be done research. So jobs to be done is this theory or methodology that resulted from, like, why do people decide to consume the things that they do with their money or time, right? And it tends not to, like, sort of follow sort of the on average data that we have that would suggest you do something in the way you would. And jobs to be done is really resetting and saying, we're all trying to make progress in a particular struggling context. And if we understand, your definition of progress and your circumstance, then we can create solutions that allow you to make that progress. And it might be very different from my circumstance, right? And so we value things differently as a result of that. But my circumstance also may change. And so a few months from now, even, I might find myself in a similar place as you. And then all of a sudden we have a similar value code, right, around a certain item or school or whatever. And so we did this research around, why do parents change schools? Because, gosh, they're changing quite a bit right now. And we wanted to understand what's really driving them. And so I won't spoil it for everyone, but we unearthed these 4 jobs to be done. My colleagues did the research, frankly. I just got to pull it into the book. But then the other bit is that you also want to understand, these other considerations around the hours that people work and the childcare that they might need. or their preference for certain pedagogies, right? Or philosophies or things like that. And I think what we saw during the pandemic, Lisa, is that just as there's no one size fits all way to educate a kid, families and parents are not sitting in one size fits all boxes either, right? And so, I think that was one of the biggest things we saw is that the district that said, we're going to get laptops for every kid, there were some families that were like, why are you downgrading my kid's laptop? And then there was the other district that said, like, we're not going to get any laptops for kids. And parents were like, hello, we have no laptops here, right? And you just realize they're in different circumstances. They have different resources, they have different constraints, schedules, and all the rest. And we really need to get out of this one size fits all mentality. And so I was just trying to, rather than blame parents or get angry at them, just try to sit in their shoes and say, what's the progress that they're trying to make? And if we can understand that, can we design schooling options that not only get what we want accomplished done as educators, but are also eliminating the friction with parents themselves? And so that, I'll give one quick story, and then you may want to, there may be some follow-ups you have, but it's really interesting. I'm seeing it right now in my own district in Lexington, Mass, where I live, right? Where the superintendent came out and said, we are moving bell times, to be in line with the research that adolescents ought to sleep later, and we'll get the elementary school kids up earlier. And gosh, half the town, you would have thought that, we had just migrated back, into the Middle Ages or something. They were so, pitchforks up, basically, just angry. How could you do this? Because their work schedule, like this, would not work with, when they go to work and commutes and childcare and so forth. And another set of families is just like, oh my gosh, thank you. Please make this change. And the poor superintendent is sitting there in the middle, just getting yelled at on either side, right? No matter what she does, she can't win. And my message is, well, why couldn't you have a micro school for those families that want the later start time, or do what Spring Grove Public Schools did in the book and create a flexible start time, right? And yeah, there's a public transportation, school transportation problem. Well, great. There's entities like Hop, Skip, Drive now out there as innovations that allow you to more flexibly, it's sort of like an Uber but for kids. So it's much safer to more flexibly support individual students that maybe need different drop off and arrival and destinations and so forth. And the big school bus, right, is too blunt an instrument, if you will, and too expensive to serve those few families. What would that look like, right? And sort of get out of the fights and say, hey, both sets of families, their points of view are equally valid. So how do we set up options that work for both of them and really allow them to keep making progress, as opposed to having a bunch of them feel like, well, we're just going to have to opt out of the school system, which, that's not the answer I think we want in a lot of cases. So, that's where a lot of this chapter comes, is trying to understand these forces of progress in parents' lives, try to understand what that means in terms of a design perspective, and get out of this one size fits all mindset.
Wow, definitely. That's great. So thinking in terms of the curriculum and the whole test environment, when we're assessing students, we go into a lot of detail about the sorting and how that impacts students. Can you share a little bit more? Not a whole lot, not all, because you want to buy the book and become a hearing keynote. So
keep the T's, right?
So
right. I mean, I think there's a few places you could enter here, but I guess, my big push is, we've built this big apparatus around schools of summative assessments, and then schools have implemented interim assessments and to try to predict how the students will do on summative assessments. And it's all in service of trying to help us understand what's likely to happen, but it doesn't actually, and it creates a lot of data, but data where it's essentially an autopsy on the student. A few months from now, we'll figure out how you do and so forth. It's incredibly demotivating to working hard, to engaging in school and the like. And there's a lot of research that talks about that. And the question was, well, what if you could redo assessments so that it drove learning? And of course, educators will say, well, we have that. That's called formative assessments. But the problem with that is that formative assessments, they can drive learning, but they can't, stand in for accountability or making sure every child is successful. And I think that's because we're stuck in this time-based environment in which, students, to your point, they move on at the pace of the clock and the school calendar in their content, and then they get sorted out into various tracks and groups, and the slow group and the fast group, and the group that won't see algebra until 9th grade versus the group that gets to see it in 8th grade, and on and on and on, right? And the reality is we know that individuals learn at different paces and paths. And so to a mastery-based environment in which you moved on upon mastery, then you the work that assessments do, because students wouldn't move on from a concept fully until they demonstrated mastery on an assessment. But that assessment now means that it's both informing, instruction, but it's also telling me, well, how are we doing on educating our kids? And we can use it for a transparency. I don't like the word accountability, but transparency function, right? To understand where all our children truly are in their learning. And so assessment in that system can actually function as both formative and summative. It can be both of learning and for learning, and embedded. It can't be, I'm not going to trust the curriculum provider's assessment, but it can be a third party curriculum aligned assessment that's done on demand. The student says, hey, I'm ready to prove mastery. And they do a project, a performance, they answer some questions, they do an oral assessment, whatever it is. And we can say, yeah, that like Michael really understands, 2-digit multiplication. Or no, guess what, Michael, you're still not there. You're incomplete on this. You got to work on this. But I think we know where your misunderstanding is. Let's work on that. And then when you raise your hand and say, I'm ready to demonstrate mastery, well, okay, great. We'll just pull in an assessment, and we can see how you doing. And then if you have mastered it, we can talk to you about division next. And by the way, it also tells you that it tells the school system, we can all look at it and be like, oh, he made progress, right? He made progress against those standards, those competencies.
Definitely. Wow. As a former, when I first started teaching, I came in and I guess the big theme that they were focusing on was teaching a whole child.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about, so when you talk about mastery-based learning for students, that's kind of what my mind goes back to.
Yeah.
But it's like, how do we bring that to the forefront?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Yeah, it's such a good question, because my own read is that we talk a lot about whole child learning, but in this factory-based or time-based system, I don't have the time to get to know you as an individual. I don't have the time to help you develop your sense of growth mindset or grit or perseverance or agency or executive function skills, right? All these life skills. But in a mastery-based environment, they're woven in. So, and to go back to the sorting thing that you asked about before, the sorting undermined all of those whole child aspects, right? Because you as the teacher could sit there and say, like, growth mindset, Michael, you are not fixed in your intelligence, et cetera. And you have like a whole lesson on it, right?
Right.
And then I take the math test and I get a C. And I'm like, but you just labeled me, because I can't remake this. I can't improve I have a C. I guess I'm a C math student. And no wonder we develop these identities of I'm not a math person, or I'm not a this, or right. And so, the part of the assertion in the book is, if we're serious about developing the whole child, I think being in a time-based system undermines all those habits, and we need to move to a mastery-based one. And what's more, when you do that, you strip away the competition of like, oh, I win and you lose, right? I got the A and you got the B, ha, ha, ha. Because now we're all going to master it. So cool, you're struggling. Well, you're my friend. I want to help you. And by the way, when we get to English language arts, you're going to help me. And then you're going to jet ahead in math and you'll help me the next, right? Like these things are not constant rates of motion. And so now we all of a sudden have social interaction. We have peer-to-peer interaction. Like we all of a sudden just bring our full selves into the learning environment in a way that the traditional time-based cutthroat zero-sum competition just excludes, I think.
Yeah, truly. So, Michael, what would you say is the biggest shift that education has to make to reach and help every student learn?
Oh, gosh. I've been thinking about this question a lot because I think in Disrupting Class, my first book, when I first got introduced to the CoSN community and keynoted, the real message was we need to move from a system that relies on extrinsic motivation to make the learning intrinsically motivating. I think that's still part of it, but I think the message from this book is the only way to do that is to escape that zero-sum education system we just talked about and move to a positive sum one where my success is not at the expense of yours. And the competition isn't to be the best along a very narrow measure, but instead the competition is really to develop the most unique version of me that's going to be able to flourish in the world and contribute in the ways that I'm meant to.
Wow, this is good. So you say that, I think that a lot of us are saying that the school's education system just isn't working. But I think that there are some people still of the opinion that it's still working for some, just not for others.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that because I would say another purpose of the book is just that, right? Which is we sort of tell ourselves a narrative, oh, it's not working for the, low income kids, or it's not working for the underrepresented minorities, or it's not working for quote unquote those kids, right?
Exactly.
I hope people read my book who think that school is working for them and realize, holy cow, it is not. Because it's not working for anyone. This book, maybe more than any other I've written, is written a little bit more for those parents, I think, right? Who think that, oh, it's fine for me, right?
Right.
You and I were joking, I think you were PG County, right? Is where, and I'm Montgomery County, and is where I grew up. My mom's one of those moms, right? Like I, for better or worse, she's a foil in the book. Thanks, Mom, for letting me do it. But she was sort of one of those. It's like, don't change it because it's going to penalize my kids. And I want to change that mindset because it's not true. Like we're not allowing, talk about mastery-based learning, or, she gets angry when they change that, or grades or whatever else. And I'm like, this is a less rigorous system than you think it is, right? Like I'm skating by because I did a bunch of bonus work and my teacher liked me, so I got an A. Like that's not rigorous. Not developing my executive, the ability to plan my time, right? My executive functioning skills. That's not serving me well when I go off into the real world and have a job. And so I want to reframe a lot of these things that people sort of think like, oh, you're just changing it for them and it's going to mess up my kid. No, this system is not working well for anyone. We all should have a vested stake in changing that.
Definitely. Wow. So as a former director for instructional technology, Michael, can you share your ideal use of technology?
Oh yeah, I'm going to talk about this a lot in the keynote. So I'll say it at a high level here. Well, I'll give the teaser here, right? Which is I think sometimes, particularly the technology companies, think, well, if only the teachers would use it right, then it would do amazing things. And what they haven't factored in is that the ask that they're making is adding jobs to the teachers' lives. Or it's adding more work to the folks like you who are, overseeing the technology across a substantial district, right? If technology is not helping us better do the things that we're trying to get done, it's a non-starter. And we can have a conversation. Maybe we got to change the model so we do prioritize it. Fine, let's have that conversation. But technology just layering on more stuff is not going to be effective. The best technology in education is that which allows us to do the things we're trying to do more efficiently, better, simpler, et cetera.
Great, thank you. So, Michael, I guess for that fun fact I was talking to you about earlier, I was under the impression, I was one of those people under the impression that the school schedule, we have the summers off, it's all about that whole farming piece.
Yeah.
Can you dispel that myth?
I'm happy to. And it shocked Diane Tavner on the Class Disrupted podcast as well. So it's not just you, right? And people in positions of power in education. We always talk about the agrarian calendar, and we think of it as this thing of farming. It turns out that the origins of our calendar are not that at all, because if you step back and think about it, the summer is actually the time where there's not a lot of work to do on the farm relative to the fall. Like the fall is really busy harvesting. The spring season is really busy planting. Winter, not much doing. And summer, there's some stuff, weed pulling and things like that. But relative to, planting season, tilling, all that, and harvesting, those are the times I want the kids home to help. And so it doesn't quite line up with even the rhythms of the farming calendar. But on top of that, it turns out that in this country's history, that schooling was initially basically year round. So you look at like major urban centers and stuff like that, back in the early 1800s, kids in Detroit would go to school something like 350 days a year. So I don't have the exact numbers, but it was basically year round. And what happened was a few things, but essentially, and just to boil it down, is that wealthy people started pulling their kids out during the summers as we moved more and more toward compulsory universal schooling, because they didn't want to be in the hot urban environments and things like that in the midst of the summer. They wanted to escape to the mountains or the oceans where it was cooler, had that sea breeze and so forth. And so classrooms were just largely empty. What's more, by the way, the sort of public health officials at the time said, well, if we get, they thought that heat was basically the cause of a lot of illnesses. So they said, well, that's great. If we get kids out of classrooms, there's less density, less likely to have these sort of outbreaks and of disease. And so eventually administrators and unions, as they started, materializing in the 1900s, like looked at this situation and were like, well, I guess we ought to codify that. And so we might as well have summers off, because like they're not here anyway, right? And meanwhile, obviously, the students and families that couldn't escape to the ocean or the mountains, now they have a summer break that they got to navigate. What do I do now? And it's interesting because a lot of people, and I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but I've had a few people reach out to me since the book's come out and said, well, I've done studies and year-round or balanced calendar of schooling or whatever doesn't improve achievement. And I'm sort of like, that's actually not the point. The point is to give coverage, to create a less crazy calendar for frankly, not just low-income students who are trying to figure out, what do I do with my kids, but also the upper income ones that have FOMO and are trying to schedule their kids for like 100 activities. But also for the teachers to create a less burnout prone calendar where like you're sort of racing through the school year and then you take this giant deep gulp and breath of the summer and then you do it again. What would it look like if you had a more balanced calendar where, you went for 9 weeks and then you got a couple weeks off, and you went for 9 weeks and you had a couple weeks off, and you went for 9 weeks and had a couple weeks off. And sometimes people will push back, well, I don't like this because, if I teach in the neighboring district and they don't do that and this one does, then it'll be problematic. Well, okay, sure. Then maybe we all ought to do that. But like, let's have that. I think let's have that societal conversation and be more open to more coverage and more flexible calendars that really meet family needs where they are, rather than just assuming, oh, this came down from on high, when in reality it was created by social structures that enabled families to opt out of certain times of the year in deeply inequitable ways.
That was a fascinating read. Thank you for including that in the book.
Yeah, you bet. I think it's one of the most
good information.
Yeah.
Great. All right, so it has been awesome talking with you, Michael. Thank you very much for your conversation. And again, I strongly recommend and encourage you to get out and buy the book. We will also have some of Michael's books at the conference, but you may want to get your read in early before the conference, and that way you can have Michael's full attention when you get a chance at the conference. So we hope to see you all in Austin, Texas. So Michael, for those who want to get in touch with you now, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, great question. You can always sign up for my Substack newsletter, The Future of Education, and believe it or not, I send out all those emails with various newsletters and the like. If you reply, you get a hold of me, or you can, if you subscribe, you can also join the chat function. But I'm on Twitter at Michael B. Horn. You can reach me through my website at the contact button, and I try to take seriously every question and request that comes in because, gosh, we're all trying to work toward this better future for ourselves and our kids.
Definitely. What about your Disrupting Class podcast? Is that still?
Yeah. So yeah, the Class Disrupted podcast still going on. If you want to hear, yeah, Diane Tavner and I still do the Class Disrupted podcast. You can check it out anywhere you catch your podcasts, or you can go to the 74. They actually distribute it for us if people read that as a news publication for their education news, which is nice of them to do. So we still got that going on. And then I also host a YouTube channel, The Future of Education, where I have conversations. So for example, I'm recording, it'll be out in a few weeks, but later today, I'm recording a conversation with a former Olympic bobsled gold medalist who has started an organization around classroom champions, basically around SEL mindsets, social emotional learning mindsets for kids in classes. So I can't wait to learn about that. And y'all can follow that conversation on YouTube as well as another way to sort of catch these conversations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right,
thank you.
Before we let you, thank you. So before we let you all go, I just wanted to remind you that CoSN conference is coming up. The registration is open. Our theme is Reimagine, Redesign, and Renew. Also, some of our events and key points that we want to point out is, again, Michael is our opening keynote. We have Michelle Zingara as our closing keynote. There's Michael's book. You can visit CoSN's website as well as information that has been posted in the chat. Again, I strongly encourage you to get the book. It's really good. So we also have a couple of events that we want to advertise for you and encourage you to participate. This year we have our second annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion events. We have the networking event as well as the LGBTQ plus reception. We have, for the first time, our Women in Technology breakfast. So, hey, if you're a female and you're interested in coming to our breakfast for women in tech, come on out. And for our male IT leaders, up your allyship. So we're encouraging you in terms of how you can help promote some of the females who are in the IT field. So, and for the first time, CoSN has some TED Talks coming up. So we have one where we have our very own board member, Kelly Mae Dalmer, who is coming from the perspective of a CTO, now superintendent. So you don't want to miss those. And we want to also send out a special thank you for our sponsors, our partners. Here we have ClassLink, DNA, and AT&T as our diamond sponsor. Our crystal sponsor is AWS. Our gold sponsors with Microsoft, Identity Automation, MindRise, Synology, and Spectrum Enterprise. So we thank them so much. Our silver and bronze partners, we have Acer, Cisco, Learning Platform, Lightspeed, Logitech. And for our bronze sponsors, we have, or bronze partners, we also have our Charter Communications, Clever, Metatech, and Mount Square. So a very hearty thank you to all of our partners. Greatly appreciate you. All right. I do believe that is it. So thank you all for joining us and looking forward to seeing you at the CoSN conference in March. And we wish you safe travels. Thank you. Thank you again, Michael.
You bet. See y'all there.
All right.